When authors do battle, they do it with words. They throw a story back and forth, each trying to write the other into a corner. The results can be terrifying, or they can be legendary.
The burning building sat on the edge of a bluff, above a cold, dry creek bed and under the indifferent gaze of a million desert stars. The burning was almost finished, down to embers glowing a sickly orange, mimicking the sunset of hours before. Two women lay beside the remains of the fire, warmed by it, both still, both silent, although only one of them was unconscious. The conscious one spoke. It didn't have to be this way. She sat up slowly, blood across her torso, some of it hers. You could have stopped this. Getting to her feet robbed her of the breath to speak. After a time, though, she recovered, tried a hesitant step, and then another. You could have just walked away. Not all of the pain in her voice was physical. Why didn't you just walk away? The unconscious woman had no answer. The conscious one just walked away. She knew where she was headed. She didn't know if she would make it. 8 hours earlier. Sylvia Anderson trudged slowly across the sand, the morning sun already beginning to beat down on her like a drum. Day after day of walking under the burning sun had taken its toll on her, and she was close to giving up. The desert seemed endless, even though she knew it had to stop somewhere. Her gaze was fixed on the ground in front of her. She heard the helicopter, but she just put it down to illusion. She had a hard time dismissing it when it landed in front of her, though. The whipping wind from the rotors threw Sylvia's hair around. Looking up, she barely recognized the object in front of her anymore. A woman climbed out of the pilot's seat and ran to Sylvia. "Oh my gosh, are you all right?" Sylvia opened her mouth to speak, but her throat was too dry to manage words. "Come on," the woman said. "I've water in the chopper." The woman led Sylvia to the helicopter and retrieved a canteen. "Carefully now, you shouldn't drink too much." Sylvia took the canteen and stared at it for a long moment. She raised it to her lips and tipped a little water into her mouth. As the water touched her tongue, her mouth protested, as if unused to the sensation. She drank some more, swishing the water around in her mouth. "Thank you," Sylvia managed to croak. "Come on, get in," the woman said. "I need to take you back to my place. We'll need to call the authorities." Sylvia let herself get bundled into the helicopter and watched in a daze as the ground sank away beneath them. Even in her dim thoughts, she knew that no one could call the authorities. Margaret Gates flew with one eye on the stranger in the seat beside her, already regretting her action. Would any of the others stop to pick up a hiker? Probably not. No, certainly not. They were all committed to the cause. "I'm a scientist, not a terrorist," Margaret thought to herself. "I couldn't just let her die." Margaret had seen the shape against the sand and reacted without thinking. They were miles from anywhere. Whoever the stranger was, it was a miracle that she'd gotten this far. Maybe this is better, Margaret thought. Somebody is out there looking for this woman. If I'd left her there, it might have brought attention to the station. This way, I can bring her home, make a few calls, and get her out of the way before anyone gets suspicious. She's barely conscious. She won't notice anything odd about the station. Control would be angry, but Margaret thought that she could explain the situation, make them see that it was the best course of action. Better a lost hiker rescued than a corpse found on the grounds. Although, where the hell had she come from? There weren't any hiking trails around here. That's why the station, Desert Reclamation Station 21, was out here. It was 2 hours by copter from the nearest town, and that was just a wide spot on the highway, a place to pick up supplies once a month. This whole area was a blank spot on the map. The stranger was in a place where no one should ever go. The whole plan depended on that. Margaret wished she could turn around and take the stranger to town, but there wasn't enough fuel. They had to go to the station to refuel, if for nothing else. Fuel the bird, find out who to contact to get the stranger gone and back in the air. The short time they would be on the ground, the stranger wouldn't notice anything. Rows of sickly plants in a fenced enclosure, a barn-like structure with a low-rent biochemistry lab in it. Nothing that anyone who wasn't a trained botanist would think was out of the ordinary. I'm a scientist, Margaret thought again. Just a scientist, studying desert plants, nothing more. It was almost true. Sylvia kept staring blankly out of the window as the helicopter settled to the ground. Her wits were starting to return to her out of the desert sun. "I'll be back in a second," Margaret said. "I just have to grab something from inside and then fill up the chopper. Once that's done, we'll make some calls and find out where I should take you." "You're not taking me anywhere," Sylvia thought, but she kept her gaze on the sand, pretending to be out of it. Margaret opened the door to the chopper and hopped out. She ran from one of the buildings, ducking low to avoid the helicopter blades. As soon as Margaret was out of sight, Sylvia opened her own door and slipped out. She took another sip from the canteen and then slung it across her shoulder. She scanned the place. There was a house where Margaret had run, a few enclosures of plants, and a barn. Sylvia could feel the hot sun on her. She couldn't be out any longer. She stumbled towards the barn. Inside, the barn was almost empty. A few pallets of plants were stacked near the door. A table was in the centre with chemistry supplies on top of it. Sylvia walked over and examined them. There was nothing of interest. She picked up a plant from the table and looked at it. Some part of her brain supplied the name. Dremia maritima. She knew it was poisonous. This one was sick, however. It had dark red spots all over the leaves. Sylvia dropped the plant back on the table and looked around. There was nothing there and nowhere to hide. "I see you found our barn," Margaret said. "We're studying a new form of pesticide." Sylvia nodded, saying nothing. "Do you want to come into the house for a cup of coffee before we make some calls?" Margaret asked. Sylvia nodded and walked out of the barn. "My name's Margaret," Margaret said, holding out her hand. Sylvia shook Margaret's hand. The house was cool after the crackling desert air. Margaret took Sylvia to a large, clean kitchen. "The others are out running errands, but they should be back later. You'll probably be gone before that, though." Sylvia nodded again. Her eyes darted around the kitchen, searching for a date. They settled on the calendar. 21st of June, 2015. She might already be too late. Margaret rolled the refueling hose and started walking to the helicopter. They were so close. The virus was almost ready to release. Years of work had gone into the plan, and now she would see it happen. A few days, maybe a week on the outside. Nothing could be allowed to stop it now. "These others," the stranger, Sylvia, said suddenly. "How did they go on these errands?" Margaret jumped, almost dropping the hose. Sylvia had come up behind her silently. She hadn't even heard the other woman leave the station. "I'm sorry?" Margaret busied herself with connecting the hose to the tank. "You said that the others were out running errands," Sylvia reminded her. "But you've only got one pad for the chopper. And you've got 2 fuel dumps, one for aircraft, one for the generators. So this is your only vehicle. Are your friends on foot?" Margaret cursed herself for the lie, and also for the fear that made her hands shake. She began. "You're alone here," Sylvia said. "There are no others." Margaret took a deep breath, calmed herself. "I'm part of the Federal Wilderness Management Program." "Good for you," Sylvia grinned. "But they're not here right now, are they?" "No," Margaret answered. There was no point in lying anymore. Sylvia brought up her hand. In it was a small gun. "What's going to happen now is that you and me are going to take a little trip. We're going to go out to a place I know in the desert and pick up a package. And then you're going to take me and my package into town. Any town. I don't care where. After that you can come back here and go back to growing bulbs or whatever the hell it is you do." "Or else what?" Margaret asked, anger replacing fear. "You'll shoot me? Can you fly a helicopter?" Sylvia shook her head. "Nope. But I bet you don't need both feet to fly." She dropped the gun's barrel. "Want to find out?" "Okay, I'll take you where you want to go." Margaret lifted her hands. "But you have to let me finish fueling first. And if you fire now, the fumes will go up and we'll both fry." Sylvia lowered the gun. "You're the pilot." Sylvia kept her gun trained carefully on Margaret while she finished refueling the chopper. Sylvia was careful now not to give her any opportunity to run or reach for a concealed weapon. "Where are we meant to go?" Margaret asked, finishing fueling and putting the pump back. 30.020 by minus 105.647, Sylvia said. "All right, that's pretty precise. What exactly are we going to find there?" Margaret asked. "A new start," Sylvia said. "Get in the helicopter." Sylvia held her gun tight to her body as she got into the passenger seat and faced Margaret. Sylvia was exhausted, but there wasn't long left, and then she could rest. The helicopter blades sped up and the chopper slowly lifted off the ground. It flew swiftly over the desert, the same desert that had taken Sylvia days to walk. Eventually, Sylvia saw it in the distance, A broken jeep, the axle cracked, and in the back, her prize. Margaret flew the chopper close and set it down. "All right, we're here." "Get out," Sylvia said. "I can't have you flying away. Besides which, I'll need your help. This thing is heavy." Sylvia waited until Margaret was well clear of the helicopter and then got out. She waved Margaret over to the jeep. As Margaret got close, she recoiled in horror. Steve, Pete and Lance were right where Sylvia had left them, rotting in the seats of the jeep, with bullets through their brains. "Who are you?" Margaret asked. "Never mind that," Sylvia said. "Help me get that crate onto the chopper." Sylvia tucked her gun into the back of her jeans and moved to one side of the crate. It was still covered up. Margaret wouldn't be able to see what it was. Margaret shot a glance at the chopper. "Don't even think about it. I can draw my gun faster than you can run," Sylvia said. "Don't worry, just take me in this crate to any big town and you'll never see me again." After they had the crate stored awkwardly across the rear seat, Margaret took off, headed north by northeast, climbing high, over 8,000 feet. The desert below them was a tan carpet. Visibility was unlimited. There was nothing to see. "Is it cocaine?" Margaret asked. "It's none of your business," Sylvia answered sharply. "You killed 3 men for it. It must be valuable," Margaret continued. "In this part of the world, that usually means cocaine." "What part of none of your business don't you understand?" Sylvia asked. Margaret glanced over, then the helicopter dropped, fast. Sylvia hit the window. "Is it cocaine?" Margaret asked again. "What the hell are you doing?" Sylvia yelled. "You'll kill us both." Margaret worked the controls and the descent stopped abruptly. Sylvia slammed back into her seat. "Just answer the question," Margaret said mildly. Sylvia pulled her gun out, her hand shaking. "Listen, if you try anything like that again—" "What?" Margaret asked. "You'll shoot me? We're in the air now, in case you hadn't noticed." The helicopter started climbing again, the altimeter reading 9,000 feet. "You wouldn't crash on purpose," Sylvia said. "It's your life too." "No?" Margaret asked. "Are you sure?" And the helicopter dropped, nearly free fall, Sylvia clinging to the straps to stay in her seat. The altimeter spun. 8,000, 7,000, 6,000. "Okay!" Sylvia shouted. "Okay, yes, Jesus, it's coke!" Margaret levelled out the rotors and the helicopter stopped falling. "That's all I wanted to know." "Look, don't even think about trying to take it. You don't have the contacts to move this much, believe me. If you try, you'll just get yourself killed." "I don't want it. You can keep it," Margaret said, her voice cold and angry. "You might want to keep it for a while before you sell it, though. The price is about to go way up." "What do you mean?" Sylvia asked. "Erythroxylum novogranitans is about to go on the endangered species list," Margaret laughed. "It's going to make number 1 with a bullet." "Just take me to the nearest town," Sylvia said. "Whatever you're doing back there is your business. It won't much matter in a couple of days' time anyway." Sylvia saw Margaret glance back at the crate again. "Why won't it matter?" Margaret asked. "I won't be around to see it anyway," Sylvia said. "Enough questions. Just fly." Margaret checked her chart and aimed the chopper for Juan Aldama, a town with just over 16,000 people. It was close enough to Chihuahua that she thought Sylvia could connect with her drug cartel friends. She worried for a moment that Sylvia might lead them back to her, but she couldn't do much about that with the gun trained on her. Margaret set the chopper down on the outskirts of the town and looked at Sylvia. "Here you go, the nearest town." Sylvia waved with her gun. "Help me get the crate out." Sylvia hopped out of the helicopter and put her gun away. It was nearly done. Only another hour or two and nothing would matter any more. She got into the back of the helicopter and shoved the crate towards Margaret. Margaret tried to hold the heavy crate, but it slipped from her hands and broke open. Canisters fell out of the side of the crate and rolled onto the ground. "What are those?" Margaret asked. "That's not cocaine." "Just get in your chopper and leave," Sylvia said. "You don't want to be here when this happens." Sylvia climbed out of the rear of the chopper, pulling out her gun and pointing it at Margaret. "What do you have in those canisters?" Margaret asked. "Get in your chopper and leave now," Sylvia said, "or I'll shoot you where you stand." "I can count, you know," Margaret said. "That gun is a Ruger LCP 380 Ultra Compact. It holds 7 bullets. There were 3 men in that jeep. I counted the bullet holes. There were 7 holes." "Guns can reload, you idiot," Sylvia said. Margaret shook her hand. "They can, but you're out of bullets. One of those men was halfway out of the jeep. If you'd had a round, you would have finished him and not left him to bleed out." Sylvia sighed and put her gun away. She walked to the crate, pulled out a gas mask and put it on. Lifting one of the canisters, she put her hand on the valve. When she spoke, her words were muffled by the mask. "Trust me on this. If I turn this valve, it will kill you just as surely as the gun would. I've very little reason not to kill you. If you value your life, you'll get in that chopper and leave." Margaret got in the chopper and the rotors sped up. Instead of taking off, though, she angled the rotors and the chopper clung to the ground, backwash blowing a hurricane of dust around Sylvia, who staggered back against the stinging wind. "Go ahead and open the valve," Margaret shouted over the roar of the motor. "Let's see what happens." Blinded by dust, even with the mask, Sylvia struggled to drag the crate out of the helicopter's storm. Margaret touched the controls, and the chopper crept forward a few feet, skimming the dirt. "Even out here, somebody's going to see this pretty soon. Explain to me or explain to the federales. Your choice." Sylvia raised her hands in surrender and stepped away from the crate. Margaret turned down the engine on the helicopter until the rotors were barely spinning. She climbed down from the cockpit, leaving the door open and one hand resting on the controls. "Now talk," she said. "No more games. Just tell me the truth and I'll let you go." Sylvia pulled off her gas mask. Underneath, her skin was red and blotchy. "You ever heard of a man named Luis Garcia de la Cruz? El Buitre Negro?" Margaret nodded. "Of course I've heard of him. Everyone in Mexico's heard of him. What about him?" "The Black Vulture, yes," Sylvia translated. "Well, this is a gift for the Black Vulture." "You're going to kill him?" Margaret asked. "Him, me, and everyone in his compound. It's taken me years to gain his trust. I'm going to meet him, and boom, the vulture flies no more." "You don't have to do that," Margaret said. "Yes, I do." Sylvia's voice was firm. "You have no idea." "No, what I mean is that I've already taken care of it." Margaret shook her head, laughing. "All this time, you and I were on the same side." "You?" Sylvia sneered. "What can you do?" "The virus," Margaret explained excitedly. "Don't you see? He controls the majority of the cocaine fields here. Once I get my virus onto his lands, it will spread in days. His entire crop will die." "You're planning to kill his plants?" Sylvia asked angrily. "They aren't just plants," Margaret countered. "They're the source of his power. Without his money, he's nothing. His own men will kill him." Sylvia frowned. No, that's not good enough. "He has to suffer. Do you know what this stuff does? It melts the flesh off your face. I don't want to take away his money. I want him to beg for death. Trust me, once the cocaine disappears, his friends will make him beg for death just as well as any gas," Margaret said. "Won't this gas hurt other people? His wife, his maid, his children? Do children deserve that death?" Sylvia stared at Margaret and shook her head. "What did he do to you?" Margaret asked. Sylvia shook her head. "I'll never tell a soul." "Come on," Margaret said. "Come back to the compound and I'll show you my plan." They both lifted the canisters back into the helicopter and flew back to Margaret's compound. Margaret led Sylvia back to the barn with the sick-looking Dremia maritima. Margaret went to a wooden pillar and reached behind it. She pulled something and a trapdoor in the floor of the barn swung open. Margaret waved to the trapdoor. "It's down there." Sylvia walked to the trapdoor and looked down. A ladder led down to a concrete floor below. She stepped onto the first rung and climbed down. "You're not the only one he's hurt, you know," Margaret called from the top of the ladder as Sylvia made her way into the basement. "There's a whole network of us. You're not alone." Margaret watched as Sylvia reached the bottom and looked around. "Where?" Sylvia asked. "The filing cabinet in the corner," Margaret said. "Everything that you need to know about us is in there." Sylvia moved away from the ladder into the dimness of the basement. I don't see," she began. Margaret slammed the trapdoor closed. Quickly, she pushed the steel table laden with plant specimens over the door. She could hear Sylvia coming back up the ladder. Margaret rolled a heavy drum of fertilizer over and added it to the table. She saw the metal of the trapdoor shake as Sylvia pushed on it, but it didn't lift. There was no way that the other woman could get enough leverage to open the door from on top of the ladder against the combined weight of the table and the drum. "I'm sorry about this," Margaret called. "I really am." From below, Sylvia pounded on the trapdoor. It wasn't going anywhere. "I can't have you wrecking the plan. Not now. Not when we're so close," Margaret explained. "Let me out of here," Sylvia screamed. "I can't," Margaret said. "It's going to take time for the virus to spread. If De La Cruz dies now, it will shut down his operation. We need him to stay in business long enough to ship the contaminated supplies across Central America." In reply, Sylvia started pounding on the door harder. "You're just going to hurt yourself," Margaret said. Sylvia gave up pounding on the trapdoor and looked around the basement. There was a light coming from somewhere. Following it, she found a narrow slit at the top of one wall. It was only enough to give a little air and light, of no use otherwise. She surveyed the basement. There were 3 rooms. The first room with the ladder had only a filing cabinet and the wall with the slit at the top. The next room had a sofa, a television and a mini fridge. The last room had a bed and a stack of books. It was obviously somewhere that a single person could hide for a few days while they waited for any heat to die down. Sylvia growled. She hadn't trekked across the desert for Dela Cruz to just die at someone else's hands. The revenge was meant to be hers. Walking back to the first room, Sylvia pulled out all of the drawers of the filing cabinet. They were full of old paper files. She took them all out and threw them into a pile on the floor. She was then able to drag the now empty filing cabinet over to the trapdoor. She lined it up under it. She walked back to the second room and opened the mini fridge. Pulling out all of the soda bottles and junk food, she unplugged the mini fridge and dragged it back to the first room. Lifting it, she put it on top of the filing cabinet. It was still a good few meters under the trapdoor. Sylvia walked back to the second room and dragged the sofa into the first room with her. She pushed it onto one arm under the trapdoor. It was a little taller than the filing cabinet, but still not tall enough. She slid some of the drawers out of the filing cabinet and stacked them on top of the sofa arm. She climbed the ladder as she worked until she finally had to lug the fridge over, but she managed to get it balanced on top of the cabinet drawers, just under the trapdoor. Sylvia sighed and stretched out her back. Pulling a small plastic lighter from her pocket and her gun from her belt, she hammered on the canister at the back of the fridge. It held up for 20 blows and then cracked. Gas began to leak out, spraying the trapdoor above her. Sylvia shielded her face with her hand and lit the lighter. The gas ignited in a purple-blue flame and Sylvia yelped. She clutched her hand to her and scrambled back down the ladder. The flame kept burning above her, playing across the trapdoor. Sylvia hurried back from the ladder as metal began to drip down. She examined her hand. It was badly burnt. She was going to make this bitch Margaret pay. Dela Cruz was hers and no one else's. There was a loud bang as the isobutane in the fridge exploded. The sofa, filing cabinets and fridge fell to the ground in an almighty clatter. Sylvia hurried over and looked up. The trapdoor was warped and she could see sunlight. It was still white hot from the gas, but she knew Margaret had probably heard the explosion. Margaret heard the explosion from inside the main building. She had been trying to compose a message to Control, to let them know about Sylvia in a way that wouldn't make them angry. It was a good thing she'd picked up Sylvia, had learned the other's plan in time to stop it. She had things under control. She just needed to find some way to explain it to Control so they would see things the same way. The bang took her by surprise. It took her a moment to identify the sound. Out here in the high desert, the winds could get vicious. If the door to the barn wasn't latched, the wind could slam it open with a bang just like that. She ran to the window. The barn door was closed, but smoke was coming from under the door. Margaret ran. The fuel for the generator was in the barn. When she reached the door, it flew open, propelled not by the wind, but by Sylvia, and it struck Margaret, knocking her down. Sylvia lunged forward with an overhand blow from a shovel, held in both hands. Margaret crumpled. Sylvia paused, breathing hard. The flames spread throughout the barn, the desiccated lumber catching like paper. Then the far end of the barn went up in a fireball, the concussion throwing her to the ground beside Margaret. She covered her head and lay still, waiting for the shocks to die down. The fire spread to the main compound, and Sylvia crawled away, dragging Margaret. Despite everything, Sylvia couldn't leave her to be burned alive. She wasn't the real enemy. It didn't have to be this way, she whispered, her voice harsh with effort.
Who do you think won the battle? Vote for a winner in the comments below.